This is NEGOTIATEx podcast, show number 113. Hello, welcome to the NEGOTIATEx podcast. My name is Nolan Martin. With me, as always, Aaron Nesian. Aaron, you want to kick this one off today?
Thanks, Nolan. Sure will. Professor Seth Freeman is a globally recognized expert in the fields of negotiation and conflict management, an award-winning teacher at Columbia University, and a highly sought-after professor at NYU Stern. He also has served as a visiting professor at several programs abroad. In his training, consulting, coaching, and speaking practice, Seth has worked with a variety of clients, including UN diplomats, Fortune 500 companies, and many nonprofit organizations. His interviews and op-ed columns have appeared in the New York Times, Bloomberg TV, Washington Post, USA Today, and elsewhere. Seth practiced corporate law for 6 years following his graduation from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He graduated from Cornell University with an undergraduate degree in economics. Seth is the presenter for The Art of Negotiating the Best Deal from the Great Courses, one of their highest rated offerings. He is also the author of 15 Tools to Turn the Tide, a step-by-step playbook for empowered negotiating. Professor Freeman lives with his wife and their 2 daughters in New York City. He is a doting father and husband. Seth, welcome to the NEGOTIATEx podcast.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you so much, Nolan. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
So, Seth, I'm also a father of daughters, and I've got to ask you, which do you find more difficult, negotiating with one of your daughters or advising a client on a business crisis?
I love that question, Aaron, and immediately brings to mind a story. I was parent on point one morning, and my daughter, Hannah, 5 years old, was just poised to get on the bus to go to school. The bus had just arrived. I'm all alone. And once I've got her on the bus, then I can go down and make my class downtown, 9 o'clock. And that's the moment that Hannah decides to lock herself in the bathroom and throw a tantrum. And I realize that if I don't get her out of the bathroom and into the bus in literally a minute or two, the whole day is ruined. So what do? Well, your natural impulse in a moment like that is to, suddenly be the daddy and, start shouting and say, open the door. It's all the things that normally you just react with. And I knew that wasn't going to work. So I started channeling my inner hostage negotiator. And I started empathizing. I go, you're upset, sweet pea. You don't want to go because you don't like to be rushed and it's too much stress and it's too angry. It makes you upset. And she started going from screaming to spluttering a little. And then I started to make a little silly sound or two, and the door flies open. She's laughing. She leaps into my arms. Yes, isn't this funny, sweet pea? Yes, you're right. Put her on the bus. Bye. And race like hell to the subway. Make it on time.
Nice.
So I've learned that hostage negotiation is a key tool for parenting.
Ways to use it in reverse. I love it. It is amazing, though, right? When we apply the skills, how effective they can be even in a situation like that.
Yeah, indeed.
Especially when you feel short for time, too. All right. So all kidding aside, Nolan and I would love to hear about, what got you into this field? And, was this always your plan? What specifically attracted you to this line of work?
Well, as I often say, I used to practice corporate law. Now I enjoy my life. And for 6 years, I was a corporate lawyer with big firms in New York City. And I got to see and participate in some huge transactions, $30 million aircraft deals, $1 billion loans, IPOs, workouts. So it was quite the education, but it was boring, stressful, and endless. And I've since realized that was because my real joy, my enthusiasms, my gifts are in nurture and encouragement and teaching, none of which really has much application in the practice of law. So I dipped my toe into teaching just to see what it was like. And to my amazement, I enjoyed it. The students enjoyed it. And so I started to acquire lots of really excellent reviews from students. And so I went from just a little trial run to a business school. And that went really well. And then I took that and brought it to NYU, and that went well. And then I took that and brought it to Columbia, and that went well. And it's been a joy ever since.
Very cool. On page 2 of your book, you state it's hard to negotiate. As someone who has trained and taught thousands of students, executives, and others, why is it that many of us seem to find this activity we call negotiation so difficult to do?
Oh, it's so true, Nolan. I think partly because it requires a certain mindset that's just not a natural inclination. We usually think that as children, that if I want it, you can't have it, and that it's a fixed pie, and the only way to win is by not letting you win. And although I'm not crazy about the term win-win because it's been overused, it can be a bit of jargon. I think shifting that understanding to realizing, oh my goodness, one can win warmly. One can be certainly an advocate for one's needs and do quite well for oneself, indeed very well, better than one might otherwise, and yet do it in a way that's caring and sustaining of the relationship and helps the other as well. That's still hard copy news for the vast world. And it's actually so simple that a child can learn to do it, but it's so important and so challenging that you can literally win a Nobel Peace Prize for doing it, as several people have. And I think that's part of the joy, is in short order helping everyone from kindergartners to UN diplomats discover, oh my gosh, this isn't as vexing and as stressful and as ethically challenged and as self-seeking as I thought it was going to be. And what that leads to, and this is really what I conclude my course and my book with, is the idea of being strong and kind. These skills help you shift from just being strong, which can destroy others if you're not careful, or just being kind, which can leave you as roadkill if you're not careful, to being both. And that seems impossible, but they're actually very much complementary. And when you have that ability to be strong and kind, not only can you win a Nobel Peace Prize, you can bring forth peace and prosperity and harmony and justice where everyone else feels despair. And what could be better than that?
Yeah. I don't know. This is where we really want to focus our energies and efforts today, is on this concepts that you've kind of presented already: win warmly, be strong and kind, finding how to navigate both simultaneously, and the shift in mindset. Now, to get there, I want to talk and get into your book, and you have these 15 tools, and approximately a third of your book, if I got the numbers right, and if I didn't, you can correct me, please correct me. 6 of the 15 tools you share really connect to preparation. And, Nolan, I would agree with you that preparation is important, and it does tie to this mindset. Why do you spend so much time on what negotiators do before they even get to the table? And how might you summarize this wealth of advice that you have around getting well prepared?
Well, it's true. Preparation really is key. As one expert put it, and I've shared this quote many times, preparation is the jewel in the crown of negotiating. Get this right, and merely doing it is not enough, and your performance in the negotiation dramatically improves. That's Gavin Kennedy, who is himself an expert on the subject. And the research, the empirical research, confirms that it's one of the best predictors of success. There was a study of 48 excellent negotiators compared with 48 mediocre negotiators. And the question was, what was the difference? And here's the really surprising thing. The amount of time they spent was the same preparing for negotiation. What's different is how you prepare. And so my ambition is not to burden readers with just, endless preparation. No, exactly the opposite. The object here is to make it easier and more useful and more memorable, so that crisis hits and literally in a matter of minutes, you can do what you need to do to make a dramatic difference. And the book begins with a student who did exactly that and may have saved her career and her company.
And when you say how one prepares is key, like to you, are there a couple key pieces to really effective preparation?
Well, there are. In a pinch, I would say one of the first things I would recommend is literally the first tool in the book. It's called 3 little words, and these are interests, facts, options. And the idea is simple as it is powerful. Instead of getting caught up with just the number or I've got to have it, the first thing to do is think about, why do I want what I say I want? What are my interests? And even better, what are the others as best as I can guess? And once you've got the interests, you go do some research, some factual research, maybe crunch numbers, but you learn stuff, which is a hallmark of excellent negotiating. And then with that information, you brainstorm some ideas that you could propose that might serve the interests, theirs and yours. And here's a tip. Let's say Nolan is about to call me. I've got 10 minutes to prepare, and it's a significant negotiation, and I haven't had time. What could I do to really just get ready when I don't have time to get ready? Well, what I might do is take the 3 little words, interest, facts, options, and I might actually go to ChatGPT, believe it or not. And I might say, dear ChatGPT, here's the situation I'm looking at. Here are 3 words, interest, facts, options. I would like you to list my likely options, suggest some factual research questions that I should answer, and based on reasonable guesses about what the answers to those first 2 things are, interest and facts, I'd like you to suggest 10 different options, rank them, that I might suggest to Nolan. And my students find when we do that, the quality of the answers is about as good as if we had done it ourselves. And so you can literally do this in a matter of minutes if you have to, and the results are really, really good.
I appreciate, what you've advised around preparation. It's so key, as Aaron had mentioned, with us in the military, rehearsals, we're a common practice as part of this preparation. When you're advising a student or client, what does rehearsal look like, and what are the benefits of conducting them before or prior to negotiating?
I'm a strong believer in what we call role playing, or as you rightly put it, rehearsing, call it whatever you prefer. The research shows that the best results one gets negotiating are by those who do the kind of basic prep that I was just describing with the 3 little words and other things as well, and then role playing with a friend. So if, again, continuing our hypothetical, imagine I'm about to negotiate with you, Nolan, and I've done some of the basic groundwork, but I really want to make sure that I'm ready. What I might do is say, Aram, I really would appreciate your help here. I would like to role play out my conversation with Nolan, which I'm going to be having in just a little while. So I'd like you to pretend to be Nolan, and let me give you my best description of what he's like and what his situation is. And I'd like you to really kind of press me as much as you reasonably can. Make it challenging for me. I'm going to play out, start from hello, and see where this goes. And every now and then I'm going to pause, and I'm going to ask you to give me feedback. How does this sound? What's going well? Where are you seeing problems? And I'll use that to improve the next phase. And we'll stop, get more feedback, and so on. And we do that 2 or 3 times. And my students and I and research also tell us this is a major game changer, so much so that I don't know if either of you have experience as elite athletes, but every semester I ask my students, is there anyone here who's been an elite athlete? And usually somebody raises their hand, and I'll ask them, did you visualize before a performance? And invariably they say yes. Why? Well, it just gets you psychologically ready. It's like, oh, I've got this. I've already been through it. I've gone through the emotional experience. Physiologically, I'm there. That's exactly why role-playing can be so effective. And so, yes, complementing the basic legwork, the role play is a great way to be emotionally readier.
I love that. And I love the visualization aspect. I mean, whenever you're, like, for instance, when we were in the military, getting ready to go out and do a mission, even just thinking through potential scenarios that could go on and everything like that, when you hit the ground, 95% of everything that you plan for is not even going to happen or go how you plan. But just the fact of thinking through things and responding just really helps you out. So can't agree more.
Well, I really want to honor the military, which has given me a lot of insight in my own practice, partly because one of the most frequent questions I get is, what do I do with my emotions? And so high performance fields like the military and astronauts and pilots and the surgeons all have a sort of a similar meta skill set. And one of them is what you just described, practicing, role-playing. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin simulated hundreds of landings in simulators in Houston before they landed. And of course, you know the power of wargaming. And the fog of war, the uncertainties of it, yeah, the plan itself is not helpful, but the planning gets you into that mindset so that you're ready to adapt. And similarly, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, they faced a crisis that they never trained for, but because they knew the basic emotional process, they were able to cope in real time, and so too were the mission controllers.
Seth, you talked about using ChatGPT to help you get prepared, particularly when you're in a short time frame. As you think about rehearsals and role plays, have you used ChatGPT or AI to do any of that work too, to help act as the other counterpart before you go into the negotiation as part of your preparation?
That is the first thing I wanted to try with ChatGPT way back in early 2024. Were we ever that young? And what I found was that ChatGPT gave away the store. And so I would have to I'd say, okay, honey, baby, sweetheart, that was great, but let's do it one more time. And this time I want you to be tougher. And this time it would go 1 or 2 more lines before it would give away the store. And I would, cut. All right, sweetheart, you're wonderful. And by the end of it, I was asking it to be like a tyrant, and it still would give away much of the store. And I began to realize it's not ready for prime time yet. Apparently, it might even be sort of wired to be accommodating. And so for that reason, maybe it's gotten better, but so far I haven't seen that.
All right. So imp and role play preferred, at least for the time being still.
I want to work with you, not with ChatGPT.
Thanks. I appreciate that compliment. All right. So we're prepared. We're ready. We're approaching the table now to negotiate. Tell us, Seth, what's your mindset at this moment? What's guiding your negotiation strategy or even the more tactical choices you may need to make in the next few minutes?
Well, I think I'm trying not to be too structured about it. Whether it's John Coltrane or Jimi Hendrix, these guys would practice 10 hours a day so that they could be free to improvise. It was the discipline that gave them the freedom. And similarly, when you're unprepared for anything, you find that you're more testy and more defensive and more brittle. But if you've done your stuff, you tend to be more relaxed generally. It can be like going in for a final exam. You can be keyed up, that's to be sure, but you're less so, and you're less likely to be defensive if you've done your work. That's one of the reasons we focus on prep. But once I'm in the room, what I want to do is first set the tone. There's something called micro-negotiation, where the very first moments of the interaction set the tone, almost like a rudder steering a ship. And it can seem irrelevant. Oh, you're going to really rip me off in this conversation? What you just communicated, even though you think you're kidding, is that you're wary and distrustful. And that can really hurt. So much so that marriage counselors report that they can predict whether a couple will divorce just by gauging what their interaction is like in the first few moments of an argument. If it's cynical and snide and snarky, those are very bad signs. And similarly, if I'm coming in with that kind of an attitude, and of course we have to adjust for culture here. Different cultures may have different mindsets. Going into a boardroom is different from talking to Tony Soprano, but you get the idea. I want my approach to be positive, constructive, and curious. One of the things that we talk about preparing for is rapport building. A couple of things that you want to touch on at the very beginning of the conversation, just to remind yourself, yeah, those first moments matter, and we want to signal positivity, not in a Chamber of Commerce kind of way, where everyone is boostering and all that, but, in a basic positive way. And so what I might do is say, Nolan, I'm really glad to see you. I've been looking forward to our conversation. I'm sure together we're going to find something that we're both really happy with, or at least that's what I'm hoping we're going to find together. Before we get into specific numbers, let me just listen and see, how's it going for you? How is your New Year's, your holidays? What's been going on with you? And the basic idea that I just demonstrated is, positive, constructive, hopeful. And one of the reasons that's so important is precisely because whether he seems like a seasoned veteran or a newbie, Nolan is anxious too. Everyone is a little or maybe a lot anxious. And so setting that tone can be important. Now, if I signal that I'm a giveaway, that I'm easy, that I'm going to just give away the store, hopefully not. Nothing I think I've said is saying, I can hardly wait to give you everything you want. But I am trying to also go slow to go fast. And one of the ways I'm doing that is to humanize it and just first be inquisitive about Nolan's, what his personal life is like. And again, if you're doing this in New York City, that may take 60 seconds. If you're doing this in Jackson, Mississippi, it might take 5 or 10 minutes. In Asia, it might take days. It really varies. But the important thing is to at least try to humanize it if it's appropriate. Then I want to listen and learn. If at all possible, I want to say, Nolan, before we get into the numbers, let me just listen first and hear what your sense is of the situation. That's called an open question. I'm trying to give him as much room as possible to maneuver. Now, we can talk later about when it's appropriate to make the first offer. In this, I'm assuming that this is our first conversation and we haven't gotten to the place where it's time to talk about numbers.
Yeah, and that's the second time now, Seth, you've mentioned learning stuff or learning. You mentioned before, you called it the hallmark of an effective or good negotiator, and you just mentioned that again. Feels like the ability to listen well and learn from that is a pretty critical to success.
Amen. I would say that listening is perhaps one of the most important, if not the most important, negotiation and conflict management skills of them all. It's really almost like a miracle drug. The research shows that skilled listening can actually reduce the length of serious illness by 20% if a healthcare giver spends just a minute or two really listening to the patient. Secret, most doctors take 20 seconds. It's a key to reducing suicide, to getting people off drugs, to saving marriages, and of course to hostage negotiation. So if it can do all that, those are hints that this is a miracle drug. And by the way, even in crisis, it is the rule, not the exception. You probably know this, having been in the military. A cousin situation is air traffic control and aviation. When Sully Sullenberger and Jeffrey Sykes faced the crisis that led to the miracle on the Hudson, where they landed their crippled airplane on the Hudson River. If you go back and listen to their conversation with the tower, the tower, and everyone else who's involved is saying back what the other one said almost every time. You don't have time for this. You've got 2 minutes and you're going to be on the ground. They don't have time not to.
It's powerful. You just mentioned, we'll get into it, about regarding the first offer. What are your thoughts on this? Everyone seems to have a different flavor.
You've probably heard what I would guess is the most frequent advice ever given about negotiating. This is the advice your uncle gave you. Never make the first offer. And you'll see this in airport books on negotiation. And there is a place where that can be true. And the reason why is because often we're going into negotiation uninformed. And the danger, if you make the first offer uninformed, is lowballing yourself. Classic story. Brian Epstein was a 26-year-old furniture salesman in 1961, and around this time he discovered the Beatles, and within 24 months he had managed them to the pinnacle of entertainment. The only problem was that he didn't know the first thing about negotiating, and he knew it, and he was terrified, and he was getting deluged with offers. And one day, some Hollywood executives offered to put the Beatles as stars in a Hollywood movie. How much did Brian want? And Brian gathers himself up, and in his most arch British accent, he said, "Now, I must tell you, gentlemen, that I would not consider allowing my boys to appear in your Hollywood movie for less than 7.5% of the profits." And they look at each other and they shrug and they go, "All right, 7.5%. And the deal is done and the movie is produced. The Hard Day's Night, which was a worldwide hit, made $40 million in today's dollars. And only later did Brian learn that the norm is to get up to 25%. Which meant that by going first, he wound up costing the Beatles millions. And we now know that making similar mistakes, he probably cost the Beatles today about $200 million. And he was so mortified that they'd find out that he took so many drugs that he wound up dying of a drug overdose in 1967. And it's a tragic illustration of this idea of the danger of going first without information. The only complexity here is anchoring, which is where the first numbers someone utters biases the conversation. And this is why when you go into a car dealer and you see a sticker price, you're shocked. And in the industry, that's called sticker shock. They know that the manufacturer's suggested retail price is crazy, but it anchors the conversation so anything sounds good and you tend to move toward it. And so if you know a lot, to avoid being anchored, you might want to go first.
Now, let's say that you're a seasoned negotiator. You can tell that someone is trying to anchor. What do you do?
There are a couple of things you can do. And here I must confess, I'm more using my guess than my research. So take this with a grain of salt. One thing that I've often thought might help is to quickly counter. So if Nolan and I are negotiating and we're talking about a boat and you're selling your boat and you start, the research, let's imagine, says that something like 100,000 is the high end of the range price of this boat. And you say, yeah, I'm looking at 120,000 for this boat. And if I haven't done my research, I might just gravitate to it and go, oh, geez, okay, I guess 105, not very good. But if I'm a little less savvy, what I might do is go, well, geez, I was thinking about something closer to 70,000, which is a comparably low number. And I bring that out quickly. And my conjecture is that if I answer quickly with a comparably extreme first offer, that might partly neutralize the anchoring effect. I don't know that for a fact. I do know that skilled negotiators do try to quickly counter. Whether it has the effect of offsetting the anchor, I'm not as sure about. The alternative is to say, okay, well, thank you, Nolan. I appreciate this. I'm going to take that under advisement. Let me go do some thinking and I'll be in touch. And then after I've left, I go find out what is reasonable. And I find out 100 is the high end of the range. Okay, I got to reset, talk it through, maybe role play with Aram, and then come back and go, Nolan, I've really done some learning about this. I'm thinking something closer to 70 might be more appropriate. And now we play it out.
Awesome. You're into the negotiation. The other party starts to appear angry, and you just can't tell if this are actual behaviors or if they're negotiation tricks or their actual genuine frustration. How do you handle a situation where it feels like they're trying to manipulate you to give in?
It's one of the most memorable parts for my students of our full semester course is when I actually play that role. First, I'll come into the room and simulate a negotiation with select students in the role of a kind of a reasonable figure we call Pat Gray. And they're negotiating this $2 billion deal. And after a short while, we come up with a reasonably good deal for everyone. And everyone's very positive and very happy. And then I say, all right, now we're going to do this again, this time with evil Pat Gray, Pat Gray's evil twin brother. And it's not going to be nearly as simple. And I go out and I come back and I do everything you were just describing, Nolan. I am the negotiator from hell. I'm loud, I'm interrupting, I'm dismissive, I'm obnoxious, I'm lowballing, I'm using every trick in the book. And their eyes widen, they get freaked out, they'll lose form, they'll start insulting back. The whole conversation turns into an argument and it's off the rail. And I'll stop and I'll go, okay, I'm out of character. How's this going? Oh God, this was terrible. Then I'll ask, has anyone ever dealt with someone like Evil Pat Gray? And about a third of the hands go up. This is why we do it, is precisely for the reason you're asking, Nolan. This is part of the world, and you can't treat negotiation training like etiquette class and assume everyone's going to be like that. So what that leads us to is thinking about or just developing a whole suite of practices that alone and together can help one manage the Godzilla counterpart, as we call it. And there is no one magic bullet here. There's no one single treatment option. So the object here is to have a variety of skills and practices. One of the basic ones is to get out of the room in a space-saving way if you're overwhelmed. There's only so much we can deal with a Godzilla, and you got to know your limits. So it's not about being a hero and thinking quickly on your feet, and buying that time may be the most important practice. To the point, U.S. Trade Representative Charlene Barshevsky was doing a major trade deal in China, and at one point the Chinese representative shouted a lowball final offer, and didn't just shout it, he lunged at her across the table. And what would you do? And, your whole country's economic future may depend on what you do. And so she did this for 45 seconds, and that can feel like an hour. And she said the first reason she did this was because she was freaked out herself, and she didn't want to sound freaked out when she answered. But it also bought her time and the other to calm down, and she could see on his face that he knew he'd made a big mistake. This gave her time to gather her thoughts. And this is what she said. She said, "What I think I hear you saying is that you strongly would like us to consider this most recent offer. And if that's what you're saying, then I can promise you that yes, we will do that. I must tell you in all candor that we probably are not going to be able to accept this, but I will at least be sure to seriously consider your offer. This might be an opportune time for us all to take a break and to revisit the matter tomorrow once I've had a chance to do that." What a face-saving move. And the next day, completely different vibe, because they knew they had crossed a line and they didn't even need to mention it. Now, that's just one example of the suite of skills that we develop, one of which is stillness, not saying anything. Another is to go to the balcony, get out of there. And there are many good responses, but I don't want to start lecturing. So that would be a starting point.
I love that. And it feels like what's behind the example you just shared is just a level of being comfortable with what's typically uncomfortable. So somebody lunging at you and not reacting, but being really intentional in that moment. And is that something you can train your students to say, be purposive, be intentional? As you think about how you could respond, choose responses that are going to move you forward versus potentially drawing you back.
They are, but here's where I'm going to welcome your thoughts, because, gentlemen, you have dealt with the fog of war more than anyone I know. And you know what a vortex, what a cauldron it can be to be in the face of even simulated gunfire. So I'm curious what your experience has been getting officers and men in training, women in training, to cope with that terrible situation.
I mean, I'll give a couple thoughts, and then Nolan, happy to kick it over to you. I would say one is the first report's typically wrong. We typically have an incomplete picture of what's going on. This is why walking into a negotiation filled with a lot of assumptions about yourself, the other person, the process, the outcome, and so forth, that are untested assumptions can be dangerous, right? We got to fill in and learn. So it's okay to go in with 60% sight picture, and we know we're going to develop and kind of listen and learn as we go, going back to some things you said before. And I think it also goes back to the power of, we were talking about preparation and rehearsals, which is to handle the fog of war and the unknown, when I can really trust the process and trust my training and, those battle drills. And I think in negotiation, we're talking about some of those same battle drills. That also becomes pretty helpful. Nolan, what else would you add?
Mine is the tactical pause. So I learned this lesson when I was in the special operations community in the 75th Ranger Regiment, and the commander had said, they just got back from an objective and they were kind of talking about what was going on from their perspective. They, had landed 7 kilometers away from the objective. They walk 7 kilometers in the dark of night, show up to this compound. They surround it. They do what we call a tactical call out. So they try and get people to come outside so that they can find the bad person. A couple people run out the back, and immediate action that most people want to take is, let's go get them. They're in the middle of nowhere. They're not going anywhere. So he just calmed everyone down, said, hey, take tactical pause. Let's just focus what we're doing here. We'll deal with that one later. And so that story had always stayed with me about the tactical pause and the fog of war, and just taking that breather to recompose yourself and not rush to failure. So,
and is that learnable? How do you, if somebody wakes you up at 4 a.m. and says you've been outflanked, as they said, Ulysses S. Grant had the ability to cope with that. William Tecumseh Sherman had that ability to cope with that kind of, oh my God situation. Can you learn that, or are you born with it?
It is 100% learnable, but it's only learnable when you get it wrong and someone's there to correct you, or you do it in training. So, as a young lieutenant, again, in the special operations, we're going to have a training event, and it's a lot of stuff's going on. I don't really know where all my guys are. I'm just stuck in my map, trying to get reports in, try to understand what's going on. And, really I'm clogging up the radio as a relatively inexperienced leader at that point in time. And I had a senior NCO kind of say, sir, come here for a second. So I come there, I'm like, what's up, Sergeant Major? And he's like, look, you can see out there. You can see where all your guys are. Just take a breath, see what's going on. You don't need to keep calling them on the radio. You can physically see where they're at. What a tough pill to swallow, but man, from that point on, really hit home. And so definitely something that is learnable. I don't think you're born with it. I'm sure some people are, but thank God we have training to have those learning points.
Well, you're inspiring me. One of the exercises that I'm actually considering adding to my course this very semester is where we have one student pretend to be Godzilla and really just shout and say all the rough stuff for like half a minute. And then the other student in their pair just be quiet for 30 seconds, really intentionally, count out if necessary, quietly, 30 seconds, and then respond. And this picks up on your excellent point, Nolan, and also a principle that I've heard that pilots teach new pilots. When you're in an aviation crisis, what's the first thing you should do? Wind your clock, which means take the time to get a breath and get the higher reaches of your brain working. And I've heard the survival experts say the first thing you should do if you're lost in the jungle is make a pot of tea, assuming you can do that for the very same reason. So it sounds like in all kinds of crisis situations, that ability is learnable, but you need someone to coach you to do it.
I think so. Yep.
Let's ask a couple more of these difficult situations, Seth, because I really kind of like where you went with the whole, manipulation, difficult tactics. All right. How about, you talked about rapport being important to establish up front. This is how about a repeat relationship? The trust has been broken. You broke it, they broke it, whatever. Maybe at some point down the road, it's so convoluted, you don't even know where the damage to the relationship started. But man, to turn things around, get moving forward, you're going to have to do something, because right now, neither one of you even want to be in the same room together. How do you deal when the relationship's broken and you've got to repair it?
I'm only interested in that question hours and hours a day. I even wrote a book. I even researched a book on that for a number of years. This, I think, is one of the most profound and in some ways underexplored questions there is. How do you cope when there is a trust problem, or another way to say it is a wariness problem? I need to work with you. I don't want to work with you. I'm afraid to work with you. And if you'll indulge me, let me just take 90 seconds to riff on this. I think the solutions to that question are one of the unappreciated keys to all of civilization. No kidding. Because for most of our history, for most of our prehistory, for the first 250,000 years or more, that human beings existed, they lived in small tribes and bands where it was basically a community and everyone knew each other. And archaeologists tell us they tended to work pretty well together. But outside of that zone, rival bands and tribes were fair game for murder. And the murder rates between rival tribes in all archaeological sites that we found was higher than the death rate in World War I. If you Google the phrase prehistoric massacre, you'll find 1 million different hits. It's just incredible how much massacre there was. So we have this kind of baked in wariness. And it really begs the question, how does New York happen? How does Amsterdam exist? How do cities, let alone countries, come into being? In fact, how is it possible that you and I are talking via these laptops? There are 400 parts to a laptop, and to create any one of them took hundreds of people who never knew each other. So going from what our ancestors did to what we naturally do today is a miracle. And it's not just because we have warm, fuzzy feelings with each other. Most of us don't know anything about each other. So one of the keys is something I call reassurances. What's a reassurance? A reassurance is anything that by design helps wary people cooperate. And we don't have to look far to find them. For example, how does a restaurant owner know that if you walk into their restaurant with no cash, that your promise is reliable? I promise I will pay you if you'll let me eat here. Well, you probably would say no, but fortunately, you've got a mutual friend, and that's American Express. And American Express is just one of countless examples of reassurances that allow strangers to work together. And I find in my work exploring peace and war that peace treaties and ceasefire agreements, how do they work? And I actually know because one of my colleagues at Columbia literally studied every peace treaty and ceasefire agreement ever since World War II. And she found the answers. And what do you know? They're select reassurances. You don't rely on goodwill. You don't rely on moralism. You don't even rely on things like, just appeals to human rights or promises of election. No, you have staged withdrawal back to pre-war lines and beyond. You have monitors with guns and bullets in the guns to peacekeep. You have incentives and penalties from third-party actors out and so on. And what are these? These are reassurances. And reassurances allow companies to form, and managers reassure owners that workers are going to perform their job, and so on and so on. And this vast array of answers fans out before us. And that's just one part of the equation, but it's one I want every one of my students to know about.
Absolutely. I want to get your opinion here. So luckily, but Aaron and I have consulted with Fortune 500 companies. And ironically, we've consulted with sole source suppliers of those Fortune 500 companies. And whenever I'm speaking to the Fortune 500 company, they're like, oh man, that sole source supplier, they have all the power because we have to buy from them. And then I go and speak to the sole source supplier and I say, man, that Fortune 5 company has all the money and all the power. How do you discuss that when it comes up, or how should someone look at that situation if they're in it?
Well, I love that story, and it's very, very common. And that's why I tell my students, you may think that you have no bargaining power. You're David, they're Goliath, but do your homework and don't assume that you know. And if it really turns out that it's the Depression and they're selling apples on the street for a nickel and you're desperate to get a job and everyone else is and they're lining up for, if you discover that as you get ready for a job negotiation, you will know, yeah, maybe I should take what they're giving me, maybe. But often, as you do your systematic preparation, you discover that no, it is not this one-sided story that you first thought it was. And that's why, again, the higher reaches of your thinking are so important. So that's the first thing, is do your homework and don't assume that you are as powerless as you think. There are many sources of influence. But the other thing is to, as a brief story, Federal Express and Dell were exactly in the situation that you were just describing, Nolan. They hated each other, even though they had a long-term contract. Each one thought the other was abusive. Dell thought that FedEx was doing the bare minimum, and FedEx thought that Dell was just micromanaging, and they just spiraling down into a powder. And then they reluctantly agreed to basically have corporate marriage counseling, where they went to a kind of a retreat where a facilitator drew out from them, to their amazement, that they all wanted to get along and they all wanted this to be a healthful relationship and they all wanted to work for mutual good. I thought you guys were the enemies. You guys hate us. No, we thought you did. And by the end, they'd actually worked out some parameters for the relationship that had never been worked out. You think the contract spells it? No, it doesn't. And they worked out how we're going to disagree in a constructive way, how we're going to not micromanage, we're going to set goals. And by the end, not that they were hugging, but everyone was much happier. And what do you know? Millions of dollars ensued. They renewed the contract. And that illustrates that both your power estimation can be way off and your sense of what the other side's mindset is can be way off too. And each of these is a treatable condition if you know principles and practices of negotiation.
Love that example. Another context that's pretty challenging is when we try to influence upward, and yet we know that influencing our bosses and senior managers is not just necessary, it's actually quite critical for organizational success. So what advice do you give to someone who says, I'm junior in an organization, but I need to negotiate with a boss or senior supervisor?
Well, there are a couple of things, and you're right. The challenge can be severe because on the one hand, you want and rightly want to show respect. You don't want to override the other and say, you're crazy, you're wrong, what are you doing? So that's not on the menu. On the other hand, you may be right. You may be seeing something your boss is missing, and terrible things might happen if you don't, and great things could happen if you do influence. So what to do? Well, I'll give you one of my favorite examples, and this is actually from the military. It stars someone that most people have never heard of, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., the son of the great president. And Ted Roosevelt, and I describe this in the book, was a general in World War II, well regarded, quite courageous, but he was sidelined for political reasons on the eve of D-Day, and he was given a command of a large oak desk. And this was very frustrating because he wanted to be on the front line. So he goes to his very intimidating commanding officer, Tubby Barton, and he says, "Sir, I want to be in one of the front landing craft." And Barton completely blows him off and says, "No, out of the question. First, you're persona non grata because of your political troubles. You're 50 years old. You're walking around with a cane, for goodness sake. I know you were injured in the war. That's commendable, but this is going to be no place to be walking around with a cane. This is a suicide run. And fourth, if you get killed, I'm going to look bad because did you notice your name is Roosevelt? The president's name is Roosevelt Franklin. I'm going to be in bad 4 or 5 reasons. No luck." Roosevelt tries again a few weeks later. No luck. Then he writes Barton a letter, and Barton calls Roosevelt in and says, "Roosevelt, everything tells me I should say no, but I can't say no to a letter like this. So I'm going to say yes, and may God be with you." And it turns out that was a pretty good choice because Ted Roosevelt was so heroic during the D-Day invasion that he may have helped save his part of the invasion, and for it, he won the Congressional Medal of Honor, one of the most heroic acts that Omar Bradley ever witnessed. What was in that letter, right? And the answer is, in a sense, a phrase that we talk about in the book. It's called, "If we agree, if we disagree." And what you do is respectfully point out, this is what you care about. And if we agree, you will get what you care about. And if we don't agree, your concerns may be ill-served or damaged. So what did he actually write? He said, look, the invasion depends on how the first wave of soldiers performs. If they fall apart, the next wave will, and the next wave, and the whole thing could be jeopardized. But they know me. They know I'm steady under fire. They trust me. They will be heartened to know I'm with them. And if they perform well, the next wave will, and the next wave, and the whole invasion could be saved. Plus, I'll also be able to give you real-time information you'll badly need when you arrive to command matters. And if we don't do that, the whole thing could fall apart. That was persuasive. And what's he doing? He's appealing to Barton's interests. You're not contradicting him. You're affirming the importance of the interests.
What a great example. I don't know if we're going to pull any more military examples out of you. I have one more context, though, and I know you've got to spend some time on multi-party negotiations with your students as well as with clients. What are your thoughts about what are some of the keys to navigating just the ugliness of multi-party negotiations with all the convoluted interests and walkaways and different positions people take and some of the histories and political interconnections and all that? When you advise around multi-party negotiation, what do you say?
I think the first thing I'd say is plan to spend time and be ready for ups and downs. It's not going to be straightforward. And there are a number of small practices that can, over time, really make a profound difference. And putting those pieces together, I think, is the key. So the first thing I would recommend is stay with the basics. First think about what the interests are of each of the players who are involved. Do some real learning. This is why governments have, intelligence gathering, is to understand who the different players are and what they're about and so forth. And also, having soft lines of contact with different players. It's not just about cloak and dagger. You really want to build relationship and develop creative options. But it goes beyond that. One of the things that can really help keep your head when you're dealing with different players is having a clear sense of what your topics, your targets, and your trade-offs are. And one of the tools that I equip students and trainees with that they love is something I call the topics, targets, and trade-offs grid. And it's a simple grid. You can produce it in just 10 or 15 minutes under pressure. And it allows you to just glance and go, to know in any given moment, is what we're discussing within my ranges that my principals have told me I can or can't accept? Are we doing well when it comes to my most important priorities? What creative options might I suggest? And what agenda items have we said are and aren't up for discussion? When you go into a meeting with that, you're much better able to follow the play and shape it to your satisfaction. So I would definitely recommend bringing that. But I would also suggest that we invoke the wisdom of Harry Truman. Harry Truman was president of the United States, of course, and yet as he was leaving the Oval Office, he told an aide, most of what I do all day, every day is try to persuade people to do what they ought to do without my having to persuade them to do it. That, he said, is all the power of the presidency amounts to. And his aide couldn't believe it. I thought you could just say, do this, do that. What are you talking about? So he comes to Columbia, and for 4 years he studies. What's he talking about? And in 1960, he publishes his book, Presidential Power. And the conclusion of the book was Truman was right. Even the president, going all the way back to Hoover, can't just say, do this, do that. He's got to use a whole array of persuasion and negotiation and consensus building and coalitioning methods. And that's why you need negotiation skills, and you need the fullness of it. You need to know how to build a coalition, how to mediate or broker consensus, how to even consider players away from the table, or as one author puts it, 3D negotiating, where you could do great, say, negotiating the Versailles Treaty, but then come back and discover Congress votes it down. That's a disaster. And so you've got to be thinking a lot about different things and situationally adjusting. But I'll give you one last word of encouragement. I had a student just last semester, it was like my baby pictures, I love sharing the story, who used her training to negotiate at the United Nations itself on behalf of the country she was representing. She worked at the consulate for one country and 4 other countries in the region who basically said, you're so good, we're going to let you take the lead. And she faced real challenge from different factions, but she used her training. And by the end, she won major diplomatic improvements in language. And fellow diplomats were saying, how did you do that? And she's just a student. So I can attest that my students, with basically using the very tools in the book, can navigate not model UN negotiations, real UN negotiations. So this very definitely is learnable.
Your final set of tools help a negotiator manage the decision to either make a commitment or walk away. As you so brilliantly state, anyone can get to yes. The critical question is how to get to a wise yes or no. We love that. Aram and I often say that you don't negotiate to reach an agreement, but rather to create a good choice for yourself.
And I love that.
So in your assessment, what is your advice and thinking when it comes to making a wise decision?
It's so true. And to the point, if you take a look at this famous photograph of Steve Case and Gerald Levin, the CEOs of AOL and Time Warner, smilingly shaking hands to announce their merger. I think it was like the year 2000 or somewhere like that, 2001. They're very happy and smiling, and there's a lot of celebration. And a year later, they had lost almost $99 billion. It was the worst merger in business history. It's a textbook case to this day. And the question I always end with is, why are these men smiling? And the idea that you can reach a deal doesn't require training. My 14-year-old can do that. Just sign here, dear. The real question is this a wise choice? Which is why I tell my students that while I love the book Getting the Yes, it should be renamed. And I invite them to mark up the cover and change it to Getting to Wise Yes or Wise No. And so I recommend 3 measures of success to test an offer before entering it. And the first is the collaborative test. Does this serve my interests and the others now and in the future? Does it serve the interests? And that's really your true north. If it's not serving your interests, why are we doing this? And second, how does it compare to your ranges, your targets? Is it really unfair? And if the answer is it's off the chart unfair, why are you doing this? Especially for your most important priorities. And lastly, Is it relationally wise? Is this fair? And is there something squeegee about this relationship? And if the answer to any of these is a red light, then you've really got to think seriously. And let me illustrate very briefly with one of my favorite examples. There are two young women who each were singer-songwriters, a woman named Krayshawn and a woman named Jewel Kilcher. And Krayshawn and Jewel Kilcher each received from a different record company separately, totally unconnected stories, $1 million record contract. Krayshawn immediately accepted it thanks to her successful YouTube hit Gucci Gucci. And next thing you know, she has $1 million in her account. Great, right? Whereas incredibly, Jewel Kilcher turned it down, even though she was 19 and living in her car. She was literally homeless. And she turns down $1 million? What are you kidding? And yet, a couple of years later, Krayshawn tweeted, "Don't buy my song Gucci Gucci or my new album. I don't get any money out of it, and I'm in debt to my record company for $800,000, and I'm facing bankruptcy." Jewel Kilcher avoided a similarly bad deal with a huge time bomb baked in it that Krayshawn had unwittingly accepted. She renegotiated, got that time bomb out, and her album sold 12 million copies, and she became a multimillionaire. How did Jewel Kilcher do it? If you listen to her interview, she used the 3 measures of success. Even at the age of 19, she said, does this serve my interests? No. Is this within my ranges? No. Is this fair? She checked with an expert? No. And she walked away. An incredible story, but it illustrates the power of these tests.
I got to find the interview. I want to use that for class. If you've got it, send it to me.
I think she was on the Joe Rogan show several years ago, and she's lovely and really tells the story in a winsome way. And and meanwhile, there's another YouTube video where you see Krayshawn being interviewed. It's called "Why Your Favorite Artists Are Probably Broke." And the interviewer is interviewing Krayshawn, and she matter-of-factly tells how she was completely taken advantage. She didn't understand that the $1 million wasn't something she got to keep. It was a loan. And she had all the risk that this album she was going to produce would work. And if it worked, they'd profit. And if it failed, she'd lose money.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Seth. As we prepare to wrap up, what final thought would you leave with listeners who are seeking to become more effective negotiators in their lives?
The final thought I would share, Aram, is that this skill is learnable as it is valuable. It's a skill that kindergartners can learn, UN diplomats can learn, anyone can learn. And I speak knowing that thousands of my trainees and students have said so. They routinely tell me that after a bit of training, a few weeks or maybe a day or two of training, they feel substantially or way more confident. And it's not just a warm, fuzzy feeling. They go out and demonstrate it over and over again. I've got hundreds of examples that they report to me. They don't all go well, but their batting average gets so much better. And when you have that, not just, I'm going to convince myself I'm confident feeling, no, you have real reason to be confident. You're grounded in reality and skill. It just makes it so much easier for you to listen, to learn, to bring positivity, match with wisdom. And that tends to produce more peace, prosperity, justice, and harmony. And that's why I'm only interested in this work 10 or 12 hours a day.
Good. Give yourself a little bit of time to sleep.
Yeah.
Seth, thanks so much. You've talked to us about how to win warmly, how to be both strong and kind. And we're going to encourage our listeners to pick up your book, 15 Tools to Turn the Tide, a step-by-step playbook for empowered negotiating. Thanks for carving out some time for us today, and we're going to wish you the very best.
My great pleasure, gentlemen. And I really want to thank you so much. You've conducted a beautiful interview, and it's a pleasure and a privilege. And I've enjoyed learning from you as well, and continued success.
That is it for us on today's podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the NEGOTIATEx podcast if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next episode.